Hey patrons, welcome back to another tutorial series. In this one we're going to be working on another loose watercolour painting, this time of a pig, and as usual the sketch outline and reference image are attached for you guys. And the first thing that I'm doing is I'm lightening up my sketch outline using a kneaded eraser, as I do normally at the start of all of my tutorials. So I'm just tapping the kneaded eraser just to lift off the excess graphite from the pencil drawing, just so then when we add the watercolours it doesn't mix with the graphite and have a grey muddy look to it. Also, the paints that I'm using are the Winsor & Newton Cotman set. They're not too expensive. I think they're a student grade paint. So use any watercolours that you have. They don't have to be professional watercolours to get the same techniques to work like I am doing. And for the paper, I am using the Arches cold pressed watercolour paper. The cold pressed has a bit more of a texture to it compared to the hot pressed. The hot pressed is a lot smoother, which means that I find that the cold press works better for loose watercolour techniques and wet on wet methods, because I find that it doesn't dry out as quickly when you wet the paper, which gives you more time to work with your paint and add all of the colours and create all the effects that you want. So I'm just finishing off using that kneaded eraser, and I'm going to start working on the pig's eye. And to do that, I'm using some purple to start off with in quite a concentrated sort of consistency. And once you have got your sketch outline down, you can see that the eye is very dark. There's a small highlight in the eye, which I will be avoiding with the paint. I don't want to cover all of the highlights. And I've just got not much water mixed in with that paint, and I'm just going in with a round paintbrush, a very small one to get into all of those detailed areas. This is the Silver Black Velvet round, just small paintbrush. And as you can see, I'm just filling in the eye in a solid colour, just leaving that highlight nice and white. I'm just going to pick up a bit more paint and just carry on filling it all in. I will be mixing in some black as well. So I like to add in a bit of purple just so that it's not just flat black, even though it is really dark. I like to add in a bit of purple just for that vibrancy. But I do mix in some black as well, just to make sure it's as dark as it needs to be. But you could mix in blue with your black or pink in with the black. It doesn't have to be purple. That is just what I felt like doing. So I do stop sometimes and just look and see if I'm happy with it before I move on. And now I'm going in with that same mixture of purple and a tiny bit of black, but with a lot more water to really dilute it. And I'm just going around the eye. If you look at the reference, you can see that just above the eye there's that darker shadow, and also just a little bit below the eye. And so that's what I'm blocking in at the moment. And when I'm starting to block in the basic shadows and structures of any painting, I like to make sure that I'm just blocking in the colours very loosely. I don't want to focus on any details. For example, there's a lot of fluffy, furry texture to the pig, but I'm not going to do that straight away because that will bog me down too much with the details. I want to just get in all of the colours. So I'm also going a little bit higher up, and you can see that I'm just tapping in the watercolour and then adding a bit more water to fade and bleed it out. I like to keep everything really nice and diluted. Once again, just going in with clean water and just dragging and pulling the paint around just to get a really bled out look, so it sort of really softly diffuses out and gets lighter and lighter and creates that gradient effect. Doing the same thing just below the eye, and it just really helps to make sure that you don't have too many harsh lines, and it does give a really loose look to the painting as well. So you can see that apart from the actual eye, it's all very light to start off with. Another thing that I wanted to do to keep a loose vibe to the painting is just sort of tease some of the paint from the actual eye and just bleed that into the areas around the eye. So you can see that towards the bottom of the eye now, it looks slightly lighter, and once again just helps the painting to look more loose. Now I'm going in with a more concentrated version of that same colour, just the same colour I used for the eye actually, and I'm just tapping it into the areas around the eye that are still wet. So the paint should already still be wet, and you can just go and tap in some darker shadowed colours. And again, I'm just not using as much water in the actual paint this time. And it just really nicely bleeds into the other wet paint because it's still nice and wet, and it gives you shadows without any harsh edges. It just really nicely bleeds in together, and this will work whilst the paint is still wet. But if it dries, then just wait for it to fully dry and then just re-wet the paper, and you'll be able to get a loose bled out look again. I'm tapping in even darker purples. It is a mix of just a little bit of purple and a little bit of black, and you can see that you've just got some nice gradients now without anything looking too harsh. I also am adding in a little bit of blue. I like to mix in a few different colours. I don't like my paintings to just be like one sort of colour. I like to add in hints of colours that are, say, next to the main colour in the colour wheel. So for example, the main colour that I'm using here is purple, but next to purple in the colour wheel is blue. So I'm just tapping in a very dilute concentration of blue whilst the paint is still wet, just tapping in some blues. And you can see that I'm also going to be picking up a little bit of pink as well. And we will be using quite a lot of pink for the pig because pigs are pink, but we're also using some purple for those shadowed areas. So you'll see that I'm going to tap in some more concentrated pink now. And it will bleed out because the paint is still wet. And like I said, on this cold pressed paper, the paint does stay quite wet for quite a while, whereas the hot pressed, it really does soak and dry that paint out a lot quicker. And I don't like fuss around with the paint much at all. I am just tapping the pink into the wet watercolour. I'm not really blending it out. I let it blend itself out, which it does very nicely. I feel like if you try and overwork it and overblend whilst you're painting, it does get rid of that looseness. I'm also dragging a little bit of pink further down, just to again give that gradient and to diffuse any harsh edges. I'm adding some more intense pinks. So I'm just wetting my brush, getting a bit more pink on there and just tapping it where I want that shadow to be. You can see in the reference there's a little bit of a shadow just to the right of the eye, which is where I'm adding that pink, and also underneath the eye. So when I'm looking at the reference, obviously I don't want to include too much detail because I want it to be nice and loose, but I do look for the general shadows and anatomy of the pig, and then once I've added the looser layer, I will then go in once it's dried and add in a few little details to just give the impression of fur on the pig, but I don't really go overboard with the details right now. I'm just trying to establish the main colours that I want and also the main structure of the pig. So I'm intensifying some of that purple for the shadowed areas, like I said, just above and below the eye. And in the reference, these shadowed areas are pretty much black, but I do like to add purple, like I said, to make it more vibrant. If I was just to use black, then I feel like it looks a lot flatter. It doesn't look as colourful. So you can go in with some blacks, but I mainly like to use purple. You'll see that I am going in with black now, and I've not got much water mixed in with this black at all. I'm just using this once I've added all the purple, and I'm just going in and I'm tapping in a little bit of that purple and black just without any water, and just tapping that in really to make sure we've got the shadows as dark as they need to be. And that's the key to a loose watercolour painting, because you're not relying really on details. It means that you need to focus even more on the contrast, which means that you need to get your shadows as dark as they need to be and try and preserve your highlights as well. So you'll see that I'm not going over every single part of this painting. For example, I left the highlight in the eye nice and white. So try and preserve certain highlights as well. I'm just tapping in a little more pink. You'll see that I'm just going over the same areas over and over, just building up to those darker values and more intense colours. I don't rush through it. And I think that's something that a lot of people feel they need to do because they're working wet in wet. They feel like they need to work really, really fast, when really you do have more time than you think if you work on it a little area at a time. And that really helps when you're doing this loose watercolor technique, because not everything has to be flawlessly blended out and blended into each other. So you can let some harsh edges like show through. That really helps with the texture and makes the painting more interesting. I've now just wetted just to the left hand side of the eye, just a little section of the pig's face, and I'm starting to drop in some oranges. I find that orange works so nicely with pink, and again I've just took a bit of clean water on a brush and just dragged that a bit further down. So I don't wet the whole pig, I'm just wetting a section at a time, working on it and then moving on. So I'm starting off by adding some purples to that area that I've just wet, and I'm focusing that around where that nose is. Can you see that on the left hand side of the nose there's that shadow? So again, I'm using purple for that area because that's a shadowed area, and like I said, I wanted to use purples and blacks on those areas. So I'm just sketching that in. Obviously we need to go a lot darker than this, but I'm just getting in a very weak dilution of the purple, just to establish where that shadow is. And the shadow continues a little bit further to the left and then continues basically on the left hand side of the face. I'm adding a little bit of pink just to the other parts that aren't in shadow. And I'm going to drop in some oranges as well. Sometimes when I'm doing watercolour paintings, if I want to see what colours would be good to use, I take my reference and I really saturate it, and it will just show and make the reference a lot brighter and more vibrant, and you can really see what the colours would be. So for example, when I made the reference more saturated, under the eye it showed that there's more of an orange tinge, so that's why I dropped in some oranges there. I'm now going in with some more intense purples and blacks, so I just mixed that together and I'm just adding that into that shadowed area again, and you can see it's very nicely bleeding out because the layer that we just added was still wet. So I'm just roughly dropping in the paint just for the main darkest parts of the shadow. I'm now just going to get even more of a darker concentration of that colour, just with a little bit less water, so just adding more paint to the mixture. Normally I'll try and have my palette showing, and as you can see this is a lot darker and it still nicely bleeds out, and I'm just aiming this directly around the nose. As you can see, the shadow, the main shadow, is mostly at the bottom and it curves up towards the left hand side. Also, watercolours do tend to dry a little bit lighter, so don't be worried if it looks really, really dark, because normally it will dry quite a bit lighter. I just clean my brush and I'm just pulling some of that paint further up to create a nicer gradient and to darken up a little bit of the top of the shadow as well. Clean my brush again and just pulling that paint further up, because you can see that the shadow does go quite high up and close to the eye. Just smoothing out the gradient a bit more, while still letting the bottom of the nose be the darkest point. I cleaned off my brush and I'm just teasing out the bottom. And I'm also adding a few little splatters, and when you just splatter water onto a wet area of watercolour, you can see that it will make these really pretty starry effects. And when I'm doing a loose watercolour painting, I try to use lots of different effects and techniques, like the salt method, like dropping water into dark areas of watercolour, and adding lots of different techniques really gives interest to the painting and creates more textures. Once again, same process, just adding a more concentrated version of that purple and black just to the bottom of the shadow, and also a little bit at the top as well, just where it curves around the eye. Also tapping a little bit of blue in there, because just like further above, but above the eye, we added in some blue. Like I said, it's good to use colours that are next to your main colour in the colour wheel, like blue. I also created a few little more splatters. But I do like to add hints of blue and say pink into the purple, just because I think adding multiple colours really does make it look really pretty and really fun. Obviously, if you just want to use the purple, you can do, but I like to have a main colour and then just little hints of other colours that are next to those colours in the colour wheel. One thing that you don't want to do is add colours that are opposite to that colour in the colour wheel, which are complementary colours, because that will just dull out your main colour, because opposite colours cancel each other out to make each other a bit more dull. Just tapping in a tiny bit of orange as well to help as it transitions further into the middle of the pig. So I want to have a nice soft transition coming out of that shadow. You can see that I also added a very weak solution of orange just next to the two shadows. So we're moving into the part of the pig that is just pink. There's no shadows now in this middle section. Most of the shadows are on the left-hand side. And because this area is nice and wet now, we can drop in some darker oranges. You'll see that I'm still following the direction the fur is going in. Even though I want it to be nice and loose, it does help to sort of give the idea that you're drawing fur if you go in the direction that the fur is actually going in. Even though it will mostly bleed out, you will still get the impression of a few little lines showing through. As you can see, I also just teased out the edge of that, so it's a softer transition, picking up even more water, and I just tease out the edge. And you can see that it just nicely fades away without any harsh edges. Now I'm just repeating the process by gradually getting darker and darker with my colours, dropping in some darker oranges and pinks. I always find that orange and pink work so nicely together. Taking a bit more orange. And I'm also creating splatters, and when you create splatters with the wet and wet method, they're very subtle, they do bleed out, and the more water you have down on the paper, the more they are going to bleed out. So if you want splatters that are really harsh, then make sure you're doing it when the paint is dry or nearly dry, but if you want splatters that are very subtle, then you can add them when the paint is slightly wet. Now moving over to the left hand side, I'm just going to be mainly adding pinks because this area doesn't have much shadow to it. So our main colours are purple for the shadowed areas, and then just the normal areas are pink like the pig is. So you can see that I'm just dragging that down, and there are a few shadows on the left hand side here because obviously we can see the face of the pig, but we can also see the body. So where those two areas sort of connect, there's a shadow there. So I'm first adding pink, and I just create a few little splatters as well as we get to the edge of certain areas. So because we got to the edge of the body a little bit, I wanted to add a few splatters. I'm also pulling that pink up towards the ear just to add a very dilute solution of the pink to the ear as well. just to get it nice and wet so that we can then drop in some darker colours. I'm adding a little bit of purple because, like I said, there is a shadow that is sort of connecting the head and the body. Where those two areas meet, there is a shadow, so I'm just dropping in a little bit of purple right where that shadow is. And purple and pink work really nice together, so purple makes for a great colour for the shadows because it works so nicely with pink. I'm adding a little bit of darker purple right in that shadowed crease. Now I'm going to get some more pink on my brush and just start to tap some of that into the area. And this has got a little less water, so you can see it's slightly darker to give us a darker value, to give more of a gradient effect. I'm also splattering some more orange and tapping in some more orange as well. Just like we did towards the centre of the pig, I want the pink areas of the pig all to look similar and cohesive, so that's why I use, oranges with the pink, and I'm also using blues with the purples in all of the purple areas, just to keep it nice and cohesive. Adding some more pink and just tapping it on there. You can see how quickly it bleeds out. And I'm adding some up by the ear as well, because you can see there's a shadow, like the ear is darker and more shadowed than the rest of the pig. The rest of the pink areas anyway. And I keep going over this area until I'm happy with the intensity of all of the colours. I do like to work nice and slowly, so I just slowly build up to darker and darker colours. I'm using dark purple now just at the tip of the ear. As you can see, there's a little bit of shadow, a little bit of the black shadow, and also just darkened up the crease separating the face from the body of the pig. I just got a little bit of water on my brush and I'm just teasing out the edges again. And at the bottom, I do this anywhere where I don't want a really harsh edge. And I want it to just fade away very, very subtly. I'm now adding some more intense oranges and creating some splatters. And by the way, you don't have to use the exact versions of orange and pink and purple that I am using. I don't know the names of the colours that I use. You can see that I also just created a few little details, a few little fur marks, just to indicate the direction of the fur. But then I went over them with a little bit of water just to tone them down a bit. And that just helps just to give the idea and impression of the direction the fur is going in without having to add too many details. I'm just going to do that process once again. And the paint isn't too opaque. I've got quite a bit of water in there. And because this area is a little bit drier, these details won't bleed away as much. So one main tip that I'd have for you guys is just to have fun. There's no 100% explanation for why I choose to bleed out in certain areas. It's just what I feel like doing at the time. Obviously, I make sure that I'm getting in the main shadows, and I do like to incorporate a few different techniques. But for example, you could have used the salt method near the nose to create some starry effects. You could use cling film to create some interesting effects. So you don't need to copy me exactly. You can add your own unique spin on things and it will turn out just as beautiful. So you can see that I'm dragging just a little bit of diluted purple just further down. And I didn't want to do all of the body of the pig. So I wanted to end it. I wanted it to be really a focal point of the like the pig's face to be the focal point, and I wanted it to do it landscape and have a background going on, so I just wanted to focus on the face. Once again, adding some more dark, intense purple just for that main shadow, that really dark shadow on the leg of the pig. So I'm just getting that in, and I'll just bleed that down and fade that away. Just using some splatters. That's always a good way, I find, to fade out of certain areas. Just finish it off with a few splatters. Just adding some more intense purples to the bottom of the ear. And adding even more intense purples. Just tapping them on there, adding some splatters. And I do find working with this sort of style is so therapeutic, and it's really fun. And because you're trying to do a loose watercolour painting, it's so important that you let yourself have fun and don't worry too much. Because if you worry and you're too rigid and you don't just let the paint flow and bleed into itself and do what it wants, then you're going to get a very rigid look if you're trying to be too intentional. Let some little mistakes happen. Now to create a few little highlights. As you can see in the reference, there's a little gap between the shadows. So what I'm doing is I'm just wetting my paintbrush, and when the watercolour is still wet, if you have a nice wet paintbrush, then it can just, a clean damp paintbrush, then it can just lift up that watercolour, or you could use a tissue, that works as well. But this will only work when the paint is still wet. As you can see, clean wet brush, just using it to lift and soak up some of that paint. And this technique creates a really obvious highlighted result with the darker paint. So the darker your paint is, the more this is going to create a really bright highlight. I'm adding some more pinks just in that area between the shadow and the face, because you can see that we have the shadow that's separating the body from the face, but also there's a little section between that sort of separation between the face and the body and that shadow on the leg. So I just added a bit of pink there. Now I'm just wetting the ear again, and we're going to start to work on the ear. So I do like to wet it all just to make sure that when I add the colours, it's still nice and wet. I know we worked on it before, but it's probably dry, so I'm just pre-wetting that area. And I'm also wetting a little bit around the ear so that the colours can bleed a little bit further than the ear, just to create a very nice, soft, blurred out look, which really creates a nice loose look if everything's nicely bleeding in together. So I just wet that area with clean water. Now I'm starting off by going in and just adding some very diluted pinks. Most of this ear is pretty pink. There's only a little bit of purple, only a little bit of shadow on the right hand side of the ear, just towards the bottom. But most of this is going to have pinks and oranges because we are using those two colours together. And you can see that inside the ear there is actually a lot more orange colour. Like I said, if you were to make this reference image very, very saturated and vibrant, it really does show and pull out more oranges and pinks in the ear. So I'm going to be using quite a lot of intense concentrated pinks and oranges for the ear, because it's definitely darker than the rest of the pink fur. I'm just tapping it on there. You can see that it is bleeding a little bit further than the ear itself. Adding some more intense purples right at the bottom, and also on the bottom right hand side, like I said, where that shadow is. We're adding really intense versions of the purple and black with very little water, just to get that nice and dark, because it's very dark in the reference image. I'm also creating a few little fur strokes just to indicate the direction of the fur on the ear, but nothing too crazy. Just tapping in a little bit of purple. And adding a few little pencil strokes, a few little strokes with my brush, going with the direction of the fur. I'm now going to get some blue on my brush, and I'm going to incorporate that with the shadowed area. As you can see, I'm also adding it just for the background because there's a very bright highlight, and that highlight on the ear isn't going to stand out if it's against a white background. So I'm just adding a little bit of blue directly behind the head and using some clean water just to, blend that out so it's very, very subtle. And then I'm just tapping some more of that blue right over by the head, and it just nicely bleeds out. Also creating a few splatters just to help transition it out even more, but we'll be working on the background even more in the next part. So now I'm just wetting the whole of the nose, and we're going to move on to working on the nose now. So I've just got water on my brush and just wetting that whole area. With the nose, we've got a little bit of shadow on the left hand side, and it's very dark, so we've got a lot of intense oranges and pinks, which I'm starting to add now on the right hand side of the nose. So I'm starting off with a weak dilution of the pink, and you can see that I'm avoiding going over the nostrils because they need to be nice and dark. So I'm just blocking in this area, and because this is all very dark, I didn't need to preserve any real highlights. Now I'm going in with some darker oranges and just working them up towards the top of the right nostril, because I can see some oranges in the reference, and I'm just dragging that over to the left hand side to nicely bleed into the pinks. Also tapping some water onto the nose as well. As you can see, it's already bled out and created some little starry effects. Now it's time to go in and add the intense pinks, which are mainly on the left hand side. I'm just pulling that paint around just to cover all of the nose. Just teasing the bottom of it. So you can see that the bottom really does just blur away without any harsh edges. And I'm doing the same for the right hand side. You can see that because I used a bit more water on the right hand side, it's created a very big starry effect on the top right of the nose. I'm now adding a very light solution of purple to the shadow. I'm connecting it with that pink area that we've done, and these two areas will bleed into each other as well. So I just wanted to add a very weak solution just to get that all nice and wet so we can drop in some darker purples. And that's what I'm doing right now. So you can see that it's pretty much repeating the same process, wetting the area, adding in light colours of the pink, oranges, purples, etc. and then gradually building up to the darkest areas. I then tease out any areas that I want to really fade away. And I do find it very, very nice and therapeutic and fun to work in this style. I'm also just tapping a little bit of very light purple onto the nostrils just to get them established. Now let's darken that up. Working that through the whole of the shadowed areas and also the nostrils as well. Just blending out any little bits. I'm also going to add some blue. You can see on the nose that actually, if you look at the highlights, there is some blue just on that shine on the highlight on the top of the nose. So that's why I'm adding some blue to the top. So now I'm just darkening it up even more. You can see that I've got some really nice dark purple and black paint. Very little water in this, and I'm just dropping it on the shadows. You've got to be careful when you're doing the wet and wet method and you're using very dark paint, because it could easily bleed into areas that you don't want it to. For example, onto that pink and orange, and then it could all become a mess. So wait for it to dry a little bit so that there's less water down and therefore it won't bleed out quite as much. So if you've got a lot of water down, then just wait for it to dry a little bit, because the more water you have down on your paper, the more it's going to bleed out. I'm even darkening up just to the side of the nose, because like I said, when everything dries, you can see that it lightens up quite a bit. So we will be darkening up the shadows even more with the second layer. So I'm just adding some more darker pink. There's a lot of pink directly around the nostrils as well, because it fades from black into the pink as you get out of the nostril. Only the deepest parts of the nostril are the black. So adding some dark pink around the nostrils helps to create the illusion, like a 3D illusion of the hole in the nostril. Well, the holes in the nose. I'm adding some more intense pinks just under the eye and just bleeding that out. Already I'm loving how it is looking. I'm just now going to wet over the other eye and just around the eye as well, towards the middle of the pig. And we're going to start to work on the second eye. So again, exact same process as the first time. Just using a very dark purple black mixture. And just filling in the whole of the eye, apart from the tiny little highlight. So very carefully just fill in this area. With a loose watercolour painting, you will have certain areas that are still detailed, and normally this is the eye. Normally you'll want the eye to be nice and detailed and a little bit realistic, because if you have everything super loose and, you know, flowing and not much definition to it, then you can kind of lose the animal a bit. And if you have a few things that are really nice and detailed and then loose elements all around it, then it really does help. Adding some very dark purple and black now, just deepening it up a little bit more. And as you can see, when I'm doing very detailed areas, I'm holding the paintbrush a lot further forward on the actual metal part of the brush to really help control where that paint is going and to get a really nice, defined, detailed edge to that area. I'm also going to work around the eye in very much a similar way as before. There's just a tiny bit of shadow just above and below the eye, not as much shadow as on the left hand side. So I'm just going in with a very, very diluted paint mixture of the purple. Also teasing a little bit of that paint from the eye, just like we did on the other side. Just bringing a bit of that purple a little bit further down. And I'm going to start tapping some darker purples. And really the darkest part of the shadow is just directly above the eye and then below to the right hand side of the eye. So that's where I'm going to be mainly tapping in all of my dark purples. And also there's quite a bit of shadow where on the right hand side of the face, you can see that there's a line, dark shadow where the face is separating from the body, and also the shadow is going up towards that right ear. So I've continued that shadow a little bit further. Just darkening up the shadows again. And I just keep darkening it up with less and less water until I'm happy with the darkness, with the value of the shadows. I'm now adding some pinks, just filling in between the shadow for the rest of the fur around the eye that isn't shadowed, which is just pink. So we're just getting some very weak dilutions of the pink, and you can see that I'm following the flow of the face, the flow of the fur. So I do look at the direction the fur is going in, even though I'm not doing every single, fur strand. I do look at the direction that the fur is going in, and I create my loose strokes in that direction just to help create the contours around the face and give structure and dimension to the pig's face. I'm just blending the pink a little bit further down for the rest of the face, just to have a very light wash over the whole of the right hand side of the face. Just tapping in some darker pinks now, just following that same process, even though it's quite a creative style and there's so many different techniques. You can see that I'm using a very similar sort of technique and process as I do each area, even though each area looks different and it has its own little, effects going on. I'm still using mainly the same techniques. Just tapping in more oranges and pinks, following the flow of the face, the direction and curvature of the face. So you can see that it curves like down and up around the eye, just like the fur does. Just adding a little bit of darker purple. Sometimes if you see me pause, it's normally because I'm looking at the reference image and sort of evaluating what I want to do next. So I'm just adding even more oranges. And often the problem is knowing when to finish a certain area, because it can be very easy to overdo an area and it just look way too overworked, bleeds in too much. Maybe you've covered up all of the white areas, and it's something that I've had to learn just through practice, because a lot of the time I would overwork a piece to a point where it just didn't look good anymore, and it looks better in previous layers just because I went a step too far, lost all of the beautiful loose watercolor techniques that I was doing. So that you do have to sort of not overdo it a little bit with this style. You can blend too much and add, too many details. Also now adding that dark shadow just on the body of the pig, just following that down, going with the flow of the side of the face. Just adding lots of water to blend that out. I'm just lifting it a bit with my tissue, because I think I did that in the wrong area. I need to go a little bit further over. So I'm just going to add pink over that now. I added the purple over the area where the pink should have been, when really it was the crease slightly further back. Thought it looked slightly strange. Just teasing out that pink a little bit more with a clean brush. And tapping in some darker oranges and darker pinks. Adding in even more pink. And a little bit of purple. Just adding that purple in the right place for that shadow. Just intensifying it a little bit. And I'm going to darken it up even more. And when you're doing something that's loose, you can decide whether you want it to be really minimalistic. For example, you could leave it here. I'll darken up the nostrils and the nose a little bit, but you could have it really simple like this, and it would be a beautiful painting. It would give just the impression of the pig. You can see that it's a pig if you just add a little more detail, but it can be really nice and simple. And sometimes that is like the best paintings, when it's just simple. Just got the essence down of the animal. Just adding a few more splatters and some more pink. just to the bit of pink fur just between the shadowed areas for the leg. And now I want to move on to the rest of the face. So just below the nose, we've got to do the mouth and that little bit of fur. Mostly it's just pink. There's a little bit of shadow just around the wrinkles of the nose. But I've just added a very light wash of pink to start with, just under the nose for that whole area. Now I'm just mixing a little bit of purple and just deepening up the shadows on the body, just whilst that's still wet before we move on. I'm also adding the shadow just below the mouth because you can see that there is a darker shadow just below the mouth. And if you want the face to stand out, then for example under the nose is quite a light area, there's quite a bit of light fur, so for that to stand out you need to add something dark around it so that the highlights stand out as much as possible. So you can see that just below the face, the body is a lot darker because it's not getting as much light to it. So straight away I went in with some more intense purples just below the mouth. And I'm just creating a few little, fake drips, just dragging some of that paint down so that it looks like the paint is just falling down and nicely bleeding out. And that helps just to end that area without having to carry it on, without it looking unfinished as well. Just adding a little bit of shadow just under the nose. You can see that by the nose, just at the bottom, it kind of goes up and then down. So I'm just adding a little bit of shadow there. Also creating a few little pink splatters just at the bottom as well. Just bleeding that out. Just tapping a few darker pinks as well. And you can see that in a few areas I will just add the odd first stroke, a little bit of detail just to keep showing the direction each area is going in with the fur. Now just mixing some purple up with a little bit of black, and really want to darken up under the mouth whilst it's still wet. Just really darken up under the mouth so that the brights stand out even more, just to really make it pop. And I'm also adding another layer over the eyes just to darken them up even more as well. You can see that I'm just focusing at the top. I didn't go and cover that area where the water had bled into the eye. I want to keep that. So you don't want to cover up all of the watercolour effects that you've done. Now I'm just wetting the centre part of the pig's face. My water is a little bit dirty at this point, so that's why it's got a little bit of a purple hint to it. So I'm just going to tap in some darker pinks. And I am going to do this in the direction that the fur is going in. You can see that it's going up and then sweeping to the side. The fur on the right hand side is sweeping up and then going over to the right hand side as well. So I'm bringing it a little bit further down just by the nose as well. And I need to add some oranges because I want to keep everything nice and consistent. So we're adding some oranges in there. And it's bleeding out, but I am creating a few little subtle first strokes. And a few little splatters. Gonna add some more pink as well, because it's all quite light at the moment. So tapping in some darker pinks. Adding in even more oranges. And adding in a few splatters. Because that area was just looking a little bit boring, so I just wanted to add some splatters and some salt just to add a bit of texture. And what the salt does is it creates a very snowy looking effect. So it basically creates these little stars, which you'll see as it dries, very much like, do you know, next to the nose on the left hand side there's that little starry sort of effect. It creates like that effect. And I was feeling like the middle of the pig was looking a little bit bland, so just sprinkling some salt whilst it's still a little bit wet. You don't want there to be puddles of water when you add the salt, otherwise it won't really work. But just adding a little bit of salt is just going to create this very, very beautiful starry effect, which paired with the splatters is going to create a really stunning look to the painting. Now, as that effect starts to work, we're going to move on to the nose and just getting some of these creases around the nose. So just first sketching them in with a very diluted purple black solution of paint, just to basically just map in where those creases and wrinkles and rolls of the nose are. And even just adding those few strokes to indicate the rolls of the nose, it really just helps just to make this pig look even more like lifelike. It really helps to add the correct anatomy for the animal. It just helps to pull it all together and to know that it's a pig. Just darkening up the creases a bit more. Just tapping in some darker purple and black just into those same areas. Really darkening up next to the nose as well. Just want to clean off my brush and just tease out the edges because I don't want that to be a harsh edge. You can see how nicely and effectively that works. So now I'm just looking and I want to add a little more salt just above the eye. You can already see the effect that it's starting to create in a few of the areas. Now I just want to intensify some of the pinks under the mouth because it's looking very light. And like I said, there was a shadow right at the bottom of the nose as it goes up and then down. So I'm just adding some pink to really start to section that area off where the mouth is. And dropping a little bit of purple because where the mouth is, between the nose and the mouth, that is very dark and shadowed. So I do want to darken it up a little bit more, and I also want to add a few little splatters as well. So I just want to tease this out first. And when I say tease something out, it means have clean water on your brush and just hold the brush directly at the edge of a certain area and just soften out the edge. So like I said, just darkening up the mouth. And don't worry, you don't need to add too much detail. So as you can see, I've just got in the basic impression of where the nose ends and the shape of the mouth. And like I said, I just wanted to add a few splatters. So I'm doing that with some pink. I'm really intensifying some of the pinks just in the middle of the face. And I'm going to create a few little strokes just to indicate the direction of the fur. Because I was feeling like there wasn't many intense pinks. It's all very, very light, which it is in the reference, but it's nice to have a few more intense pinks. For example, the nose is meant to be a little bit darker, so I'm just adding a few intense pinks there. Just adding a bit of pink just on the right hand side. And we've nearly done all of the areas on the pig. We've got to just block in the ear. You can really see the effect. If you look above the right eye, you can really see how that salt is working. And it's making that area look so much more interesting than it did before. If it was just, you know, just watercolour, it wouldn't have looked as interesting. So incorporating splatters, using salt, bleeding areas out, dropping water into certain darker areas to create little starry effects, using different colours, adding harsh and blurred out edges, preserving white highlights, using a damp brush to lift up some colour. All of those techniques really does help to get a really good result. Really interesting, very loose, and very interesting painting. At the moment, I'm just faffing around a little bit. Just sort of making a few little tweaks, nothing major. Now I'm just looking around the reference. I just wanted to have a little quick look. If you ever see my arm going up there, it's because I am looking at the reference just to check everything, just to zoom in or zoom out. So now I'm just adding a little bit of shadow just to the top of the pig's head, because if you look at the reference, you can see that just at the top there is a little bit of shadowed fur as it leads onto the ear. So I just wanted to mark that in so we could also see a definitive edge to the top of the head, a definitive like cut-off point. I'm just wiping away any little bits of salt which are where they shouldn't be. They've gone a little bit astray. And I'm just wetting the ear now because we need to get that in. And this ear is very dark, so we're going to be using lots of purples and blacks. Not really many pinks, just a few bits of pink. But mainly we're just going to be using purples and blacks. So I'm first just wetting it with just normal water, no paint at the moment. Also wetting a little bit beyond the ear like I did before so that it can bleed out. As you can see, we've got a very nice soft look on the other ear where it's been allowed to bleed out beyond the edge of the ear. So I'm just mixing some purple and a little bit of black. And we're going to start off in the middle part of the ear, going in very dark to start off with, not much water on my brush at all with the paint. And I'm just basically blocking in the darkest part to start off with, and then I will add more water so that we get a weaker dilution of paint as we do the slightly lighter area. So I'm really just filling in this whole area to start off with. You can see that I am using lines. I'm not like going in circular motions and blending it out. I'm just using subtle lines that are sweeping with the direction the fur on the ear is going in. So these lines are bleeding out a little bit, but it gives the impression of the direction the fur is going in. Whereas if you did like circular motions, you'd have no idea or even the faintest bit of detail showing the direction of the fur. And it will look a bit flat at the moment because it's just one shade, but once we drop in some darker blacks and purples, it will really start to look more three-dimensional. Just working on that little bit of shadow on the sort of front bit of the ear, not the inside bit. Just feathering that up to meet the rest of the ear. And adding a few splatters to help transition the ear to the rest of the face. Like I said, I'm going in and adding a lot more intense blacks with a little bit of purple mixed in, mainly black at this point. And the inside part of the ear is the darkest part. And you can see that has helped so much. Now just adding a few little splatters around the ear with some pink and some water so that we'll get those little starry effects on the ear as well. Like I said, it's a great technique to use for shadowed areas. You can see how already we can see those little stars forming, and it just creates a really great effect on the dark areas. Just tapping in some really dark black, creating a few little splatters with the black as well. Not a fan of that one at the top, so whilst it's still wet, you can literally just remove it and lift it with a clean tissue. And it's like erasing it. Look how much of a difference just adding a little bit of water, splattering in just a little bit of water, has done on that ear. It's created that really highlighted starry effect, that little cauliflower effect. I'm adding some more shadow towards the bottom now for the shadow on the right hand leg and on the body. Just teasing away the edges of that as well. And I'm basically just going throughout all of the shadows and just darkening them up with the same mixture that I use for the darkest parts of the ear. And most of the face is pretty dry, so it won't bleed into all of the other areas, like the pinks on the nose, which is really great. And like I said, if you don't want certain edges to be harsh, you can easily just go and bleed them out with some clean water. Just going over the nose, over the creases in the nose. As you can see now, I'm just using some water just to bleed out a few areas. Just the bottom and even the inside part as well. I didn't want such a harsh edge between the purple and the pink. And I want to go in and darken it up even more. Do both of the nostrils. And I haven't really been using many paintbrushes. I think I only have like 2 paintbrushes that I've been using. 3 maximum. Mainly you could probably do it with just one paintbrush, but I like to have a tiny one for the really detailed areas. And I've just been using round brushes, no flat brushes or anything in this painting. I'm using the tiny bit of water in with this black paint now. It's mainly just black. You can see how much it's making that area pop now, because you're really darkening the shadows up, which helps to create a really nice, you know, contrast between the darkest areas and the highlights. See, look at that ear, look at that water, what it's done. It just keeps going, it keeps creating a really beautiful effect. And in certain paintings, like for example, if you're doing realism, then having something like that happen would be your like worst nightmare. But when you're doing a loose watercolor painting, those types of things you want to happen. You want to have water, you know, creating those cauliflower effects. And yeah, it's great what the watercolors can do and how beautiful it can create effects. I'm now just tweaking a few little things. Like every area is pretty much done on the pig. Like it's got its first layer down, I mean. But I just need to add more details, deepen up some areas, which I'm mainly doing now. I'm working at the moment on darkening up the shadowed areas, just with that purple. Some areas need to be darkened up more than others. Mainly I'm just using a very diluted version of the purple, a bit darker than the last one, and then tapping in the really dark colours so that it doesn't look too harsh, too uniformed. I still want to have that really loose watercolour effect. So as you can see, I just added light purples, and now I'm going in with the blacks and tapping them in, creating a few splatters as well to help keep that looseness to the painting. Remember, if you don't like any of the black splatters that you've done, if you feel they're too harsh, you can lift a few of them up. And just like that, they're gone. So I'm just looking at the painting now, looking at the reference, seeing what I need to do now. Take this moment as well to look at your painting, see what you need to do. So I just want to work on the ear, and as you can see, I'm creating a few little detailed fur marks, and because the ear has dried, it won't bleed out at all. I also knew I needed to darken up the shadow on the ear because it was very, very light, pretty much light purple white, so I'm going in and darkening that straight up. But you can see I used that opportunity for the paint to be dry to add in a few little detailed hairs on the ear, just a couple. But adding those few hairs is going to help so much with the impression of the pig, making it look like a pig, showing the direction the fur is going in. It really does help. I'm adding some more intense purples as well on top of the black, and going over some of those little bits of fur as well. I'm going to do the same thing just under the ear where that shadow continues. Just adding even more purple now. I hope you like how yours is turning out at the moment. I hope yours is looking good and that you're happy with it, and that you've tried a few new techniques and learnt something new. Just adding some darker black and purple on the left hand side to this shadow. Just tease out one of the edges, and on the other side, and just at the bottom. But remember, if you add a lot of water, then it could dilute the paint when it bleeds out, because if you add a lot of water to tease out the paint, then because that paint is bleeding into that area, it will lighten it even more. So you may want to go in and add some more concentrated purples and blacks just to keep it, you know, as dark as it needs to be. Just adding a few little wisps of fur just on the ear again. Just to help indicate the edge of the ear, doing the same thing at the top of the pig's head. I just want to bleed that out because it's a little bit harsh. I want to add some darker pink to the ear as well, because inside the ear is very light. So I'm just adding some more intense pinks, using some water to help bleed them out so that it's not too harsh of an edge. Just going to tap in some darker pinks and purples, create a few splatters as well. I'm also going to go in with a little bit of blue. A little bit of orange as well, just under the eye. Just going in with orange, not blue, sorry. Forgetting my colours. And even you can add little hints of yellow as well. And really, I'm just darkening up areas that I need to, areas that once dry don't look dark enough. And like I said, when you're doing something loose, because you're not having so many details, it's important that you're focusing on contrast. It's such a big thing with a painting and with a drawing, even with like realism, any sort of style. Contrast is something that's key. No matter whether you're doing something really abstract or realistic or, you know, very loose, you want to make sure that you've got in a range of values. Just want to darken up under the mouth as well. Just tap over it a little bit just to lighten it up. I just wanted to stain under the mouth a little bit. So if you just want to stain an area, then you can go in with some darker paint, wash it over the area, and then go in with some tissue. And the tissue will lift most of it up, but it'll leave a little bit, which will look like a nice glazed colour. See, for example, you could just leave it. Here I'm going to add some darker shadows throughout the painting, but you could just leave it like this. You don't have to add a background at all. You could add some bigger splatters going throughout the rest of the paper. And you can see that the way I've done the pig is I haven't done it directly in the centre. I've done it slightly off centre just to make it look more interesting. Just a slightly better composition than it just being directly in the middle. I just feel like putting it slightly to the side just makes it look a little bit better. Just doing the same thing, not much else to say about the technique. I'm just using the same colours that I'm using in that area. Using pinks on the nose, just darkening up that area. But anyway guys, that is pretty much it for this first part, and in the next part we're going to be focusing on working on the background. We're also going to be working on the pig a bit more, darkening up the pig, and we're just going to basically finish off the painting. And then in the third part, we're going to be working on adding highlights with gouache. So I'll see you guys in the next part where we will carry on this painting. So yeah, I hope you are liking how yours is looking. Take this time to finish off the pig, the layer, and then we'll move on to the background. Bye everybody.